Hi, it's Penny here, and this is going to be me wrapping up all the books that I read in October. I think I've got 13 books for October, which actually I'm just realizing is a very appropriate number. I do have a couple of spooky reads on here, but mostly just general sci-fi and fantasy. As usual, I'm going to do this book battle style, which means I pair up all the books and I battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. So let's get into the first battle. We have God's War by Cameron Hurley up against Echo of Worlds by M.R. Carey. So both of these are like sci-fi fantasy, I guess. First up, we have God's War by Cameron Hurley. This is the first book in the Beldame Apocrypha series, and also part of my project where I'm rereading books that I read 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, I gave this series 3 stars. On a reread, this is a 4.5 star, almost a 5-star read, not quite, but like, I really liked this. So we're following this woman named Nyx, who is a bounty hunter in this world where there's a religious war going on that most of our characters have a history with, but also most of the kind of crew that Nyx ends up working with aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily believe in this religious war. As well as Nyx and some other people from her country, we also have another guy whose perspective we get called Reese, and he's been exiled from his country and having to live in this country whose religious practices are very different from what he believes in. And just the dynamics between all the different characters is so well done. They're all kind of screw-ups in their own ways, but also kind of trying to do their best in a difficult situation. So Nyx actually was initially an assassin for the government, tracking down men, or boys as she often refers to them, that have deserted from the front lines of the war. She would track them down, cut off their heads, and claim the bounty for that. But she started doing like more black market bounty hunting just to make ends meet. But then these aliens arrive on the scene. The aliens actually just being other humans, but because this planet's been closed off for quite a long time, they consider humans from off-world to be aliens, and they're messing around with the politics of the world and potentially going to have a big impact on the war. And Nyx and her crew gets pulled in to kind of help out or do something, try and track someone down as a part of that. And I really loved a lot of the perspective in here about war and just these characters kind of carrying a lot of trauma as a result of everything that's going on in the world around them. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this trilogy. So this I really loved. Then we have Echo of Worlds by M.R. Carey. So this is the second book in his Pandominion duology, which is a multiverse series. We do start in our Earth, maybe, or a very similar version of Earth, but a slightly more apocalyptic version, I guess, where climate change is really turned into a climate disaster and there's wars. I still feel like I'm describing our current reality, but all of what's happening now, except to the point where people are giving up on civilization, I guess. And we're following this one scientist who continues to keep doing her work regardless of everything falling apart around her. And then she discovers multiverse travel. But when she is exploring these other multiverses, she comes across the Pandominion, who are not very happy about her interfering with their space. So the Pandominion is like a group of multiverses with a single governance structure. And then as well, the Pandominion has also come across this like machine society, and that is also kind of escalating into an apocalyptic type situation that our main characters are trying to deal with in this book. So I really wanted to love this, but I think this whole book really suffered from the pacing problems of the second half of the first book. I loved the first half of the first book. And then everything kind of went downhill for me. There was a lot of kind of action scenes, but the pacing of the action was so slow that it kind of was like a quarter of the book would be just almost a single scene, and a lot of the action that we were getting didn't really drive the plot forward. There are some interesting themes kind of being looked at within this to do with like AI and governance and bureaucracy, and I guess the value of life. Human life, maybe not just human life. Like, this had some really cool ideas in the book, but just the way the plot came together and the pacing, as well as kind of the lack of character development, or the way that often the characters felt like cartoonish versions of themselves, just meant that this didn't quite hit the emotional beats that I think it could have. if it had been a little bit different, but I think maybe people who like very action, kind of cool multiverse stories maybe will like this, but unfortunately it was not the multiverse story that I was hoping for. So then the thing is though, normally when I do a battle, I don't let rereads win the battle. However, I mean, this was a million times better than this. And also, I haven't read this in 10 years. I'm sort of starting to think that maybe when I'm talking about my rereads from 10 years ago, maybe they should be allowed to win the battle. Let's make that a rule from now on. So in that case, I'm definitely going to pick this as the winner of the battle. Okay, then next we have a couple of more traditional fantasy novels. We have Age of Empyre by Michael J. Sullivan up against Tower of Thorns by Juliet Marillier. So, Age of Empyre is the final book in the Legends of the First Empire series. I can never remember the name of the series. This is a 6-book series, and I kind of wish it had been less books because I just again have some criticisms around the pacing, but I'm willing to accept that maybe that's just my preference, and this still, like, I feel like I'm jumping straight into criticism. What I do want to say is I think this is a really great fantasy series, especially a fantasy series with a lot of like classical fantasy elements within it. We've got your elves and your dwarves, dragons, magic, all sorts of cool stuff going on in the series. And I did really care about a lot of the characters. I just think at the beginning of the series, I was totally on board with these characters' journeys, but by the end of the series, I felt like we were rehashing things a lot of the time and like really belaboring the point with a lot of their like character journeys. And just often I felt like we were stuck in this emotional part of the characters' journeys and the plot wasn't moving forward. And I think I wouldn't have minded that if it hadn't felt like just the same emotional thing over and over, like repetitively. Also, we learn a lot in this series, and specifically in this book, about the gods and the afterlife of this world. And some of it was really cool. There's one particular character that I think is really cool, but a lot of the other stuff wasn't quite there. Oh, it was so close. It was so close to being amazing. And I think that's why I feel like I'm falling into criticizing this when actually I think this was really good. But I just think it was so close to being amazing. If only I'd made it. But instead it's just like really good, solid fantasy. I had a good time with it. I just was so close to being top tier amazing fantasy, but instead it was just like solid, good. If you like fantasy, I think you'll really enjoy this series. Oh, and I guess I should say, like, this 6th book of the series did do a pretty good job of, like, bringing all the different threads together. There'd been, like, a lot of hints of the future, or, like, characters who kind of have some idea of the future, and we'd been given, like, foreshadowing about that earlier in the series, and a lot of that came together in a very satisfying way, and it also like fits really well with what we knew, because this is a prequel series to his earlier Rhyria Chronicles, and so we already knew something about the events of this, although some of it wrong, which is part of what makes this so great. We already knew some of that from the other series, so that all fits together really well. I don't know, I'm mixed on whether I should do a series review for this series. I feel like I just talked too much about it, so maybe I do have a lot to say. We'll see. Then as well, we have Tower of Thorns by Juliet Marillier. So this is the 2nd book in the Blackthorn and Grimm trilogy, where we're following Blackthorn and Grimm. Initially, they're both in prison for different reasons. Maybe the person who put them in prison wasn't a great guy. Maybe Blackthorn would love to get revenge on them. But when it looks like instead she's just going to be executed, she makes a deal with the Fae that allows her to escape the prison. But the deal is that for the next 7 years, she has to stay away, not indulge in vengeance. And instead, anytime someone asks her for help, she has to give that help to the best of her ability. So then Blackthorn ends up traveling with Grimm, who is kind of this big, tough guy, but also a teddy bear at heart. I love him. We learn a lot about his backstory in the 2nd book, and that was the best part of the book, in my opinion. Just, it made me very emotional. I cried a couple of times. So well done. But as well, in both the first 2 books of the series, they've had like a bit of a magical mystery to figure out. In this one, there is this tower surrounded by thorns where this horrible like wailing and screaming is coming from the tower, and it like gives everyone quite extreme depression as a result of having to listen to that all the time. And Blackthorn's trying to use her magical knowledge to figure out what to do about it. And there were some nice twists and turns with that mystery, because I will say the first book in the series, even though it was still very emotionally satisfying, I did think the ending was very predictable. Second book, not quite as predictable. And again, this is a series that I'm really excited to continue. I'm going to be finishing off the next book in November. So if I am putting these two books up against each other, I feel like I complained a lot more about Age of Empire, so you would think this would be an easy battle. It's actually not. I did think Tower of Thorns had some bits where it dragged a little bit as well. Actually, is it me? I'm not sure. Lately, I feel like I've been complaining a bit about books having a pace that's dragging or the plot's not moving enough for me, and I'm a little bit suspicious that I'm just being a little bit impatient at the moment. But regardless, there was a lot more to the plot of Age of Empire, and it did do a good job of like bringing everything together in a really satisfying way, but it definitely didn't engage me as much emotionally. And I think as well, while Michael J. Sullivan's writing is like, what's the right word for it? Like really solid fantasy writing. It doesn't really compare to Juliet Marillier's writing. Like sometimes it's so beautiful and she always kind of weaves this idea of storytelling into her books. So I think I am going to pick Tower of Thorns to go through to the next round. Okay, then next we're going to do a battle between two sets of 3 books each. We have the first half of the Book of the Order series by Philippa Ballantine up against the Losing Christina trilogy by Caroline B. Cooney. So firstly, the Book of the Order series. This is a quartet. I read the first book, the second book, and also this little prequel short story. I was going to say novella, but it's very short. That's kind of set before both of these books. And it was included in the ebook of this first one, which is how I read it. So this is another book series that I read 10 years ago and I decided to reread. It's a New Zealand fantasy author, and I will admit some of the writing is a little bit clunky, although I can't tell if it was because I was getting used to it or if it actually improved, but I found it easier going as I got through these 2 books, and I love the idea of this fantasy series. So basically we have a world where ghosts and specters, or they call them geists and specters and all sorts of other words depending on what kind of creature they are, sometimes will come through from the other side, and we have our main characters in this series whose job is to go and send these geists or whatever back through to the other side and keep people safe. But in both these books there's kind of creatures from the other side doing a little bit of scheming to get through into our world or into this world and cause a lot of trouble. There's also a lot of corruption within the order that they are part of. And we also actually get the perspective of the exiled prince. So our main characters work for the new emperor who basically came in and took over this new country. And the exiled prince, that's the son of the old king, he has this curse on him where sometimes he will transform into a lion or some kind of other crazy Geist Lord creature. Anyway, there's a lot going on with the magic of the world and like the politics of the world, and it all does come together in a really satisfying way. It's also, our main characters are all quite connected to the things that are going on in different ways, and I really like the characters. I find them very likable and enjoyable to, be following along on their journey. So I'm looking forward to continuing this quartet as well. And I'm hoping the writing will continue to improve. I will say the little short story that I read was pretty pointless. It's kind of a story about the first time that the Geists came to this particular country and the troubles they caused. But instead of like giving me some more information, it really just left me with a lot more questions that made me feel like the initial setup didn't entirely make sense. So I'm actually going to pretend I didn't really read that prequel short story because I don't think it was very good. Then I also read this trilogy. I think it is called the Losing Christina trilogy, but the first book is The Fog, then we have The Snow and The Fire. So these are point thrillers from like the 1990s, or I think the first book came out in 1989. I initially read these when I was a teenager, or I think like a 10-year-old probably. but I did reread it about 10 years ago. So again, this is another one that I'm rereading after having read it 10 years ago. And I really loved the first book in this trilogy. It is so well written. We're following this young girl named Christina. She is one of these kids that live on this island, but during the school year, they will come over, once they're of high school age, they'll come over to the mainland to go to school. And they're boarding, starting from this year, with the high school principal and his wife, who's a teacher at the school. So this is Christina's first year on the mainland, first year in high school, and things are strange. Actually, right from the beginning, this older girl that she's rooming with, this older girl from the island, is very unhinged and has some very strange ideas about the ocean, but things just kind of get weirder and weirder, and it becomes clear that this high school principal and his wife that maybe don't actually have these island children's best interests at heart. So yeah, the first book, amazingly atmospheric. I really loved it. It was so well put together, kind of terrifying, mostly terrifying about the way that an adult really could mess with a teenager if they wanted to. But I love this first book. The next two books kind of got worse and worse. They weren't quite as atmospheric. Some of the writing was a little bit like, what? Definitely some of the ways it was handling certain issues weren't that great, or at least do show these books age. And then the last book especially was very lacking in cohesion. It just felt like Caroline B. Cooney had thrown a bunch of different elements in there, but didn't really have a way to pull it all together. Whereas in the first book, even though there are a few different things going on, it all comes together really well. But I guess actually what I should do is just pick one book to be part of the battle. So we'll pick The Fog, obviously the best in the trilogy. And then I guess I'll put it against the second book in the Book of the Order series because, as I said, the series has been improving as I go along. And if I am putting these two books up against each other, I think purely for the writing, I'm going to pick The Fog. Just so wonderfully atmospheric, and I really felt pulled into the story, even though it's a YA thriller, which you wouldn't think, I haven't been enjoying a lot of YA books lately, but this, maybe it was the nostalgia, but I really love it. So that'll be the winner of the battle. Okay, then let's do a battle of the three weird books that I read this month. So we have The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling, up against School of Shards by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, up against The Dawnhounds by Sascha Stronach. So firstly, The Starving Saints. This is a book that possibly I shouldn't have picked up, but I was just a little bit tempted by the things I heard about it, so I decided to try it. And even though I did consider DNFing it multiple times, it did just manage to pull me through in terms of keeping me interested. So basically we are following, three main characters primarily who are all stuck in this castle that's under siege. One of our main characters is a heretic, and she's been tasked with trying to feed the population of this castle, even though they don't have any food. They do think she might be able to do it because she accidentally performed a miracle and was able to give them clean water, but she doesn't really entirely understand her own scientific process. And what I like best about her is she does have these two kind of creatures as her pets. Well, she kind of accidentally summoned them. They're a little bit like cats, but also, they act like cats, but they were kind of described maybe more like demons. It's not entirely clear. As well, there is a knight whose perspective we're getting, and then another girl who is, I guess her motivation is she wants to get revenge on the knight for things that happened previously in another castle where they did also end up starving, just like they are now. So it takes a while to kind of set up these characters and their situation, and then the saints of this world turn up in the castle and things do get somewhat weird. To be honest, I wish it had been weirder. I just think it promised really weird, and instead it only gave a little bit weird. And I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think maybe people who don't read a lot of weird books would be like, wow, this is so weird. I was just mostly bored. There were a few cool little weird bits, but I just think it needed to lean into it even more. And there's times in this book where things are happening to the characters where then later they really have to doubt whether their perspective was true or not. And I think it could have done even more weirdness with that. But instead, mostly the plot just felt very functional, the characters just doing things slowly that they needed to do. I don't know. my summary for this book is it wasn't weird enough. I almost DNF'd it. It does have a very low average rating, but I can see that some people really loved it, and I was really hoping it would be me, but unfortunately not. Then we have School of Shards. So this is the third and final book, I'm pretty sure, in the Vita Nostra trilogy. It was just translated from Russian to English. And I did, in fact, reread the first 2 books in the trilogy in preparation for reading this third book. And I am glad that I did that because I really renewed my love for the first book in the trilogy. And I actually enjoyed the second book in the trilogy more on a reread. This third book, once again, not quite as good. So basically the first book in the trilogy, amazing, one of my most favorite books ever. The second book, okay, but a little bit repetitive of a lot of the same ideas and lacking kind of some of the transformation and the weirdness. And then the third book, again, it just felt a little bit directionless. So in the first book, we're basically introduced to our main character, Sascha, and she ends up at this Institute for Special Technologies where the classes are all very abstract and strange, and the students are kind of forced into this metamorphosis, this transformation into something else. And the second book kind of just continues our main character's transformation. The third book, Sascha is now essentially a teacher at the school. Actually a lot more, but let's say she's a teacher at the school, and there's a couple of young men, well, 3, a set of twins and another guy that she's brought into the school hoping to kind of like help the school with some problems it's got. It's very hard to talk about this without spoilers. So we get a mix of perspectives, some of Sascha's perspective and then some of these boys. I will say the audiobook, it was very hard to keep track of whose perspective I was in because it would skip, like you'd just get one breath between one boy's perspective and another boy's perspective, and they're just teenage boys. They weren't different enough. They were different, but they weren't different enough that I could always immediately tell, oh, we've skipped to another perspective. And so sometimes I was a little bit confused by it. But also, even though the plot was fine, it just didn't really build on anything. I think that's why this series feels like it goes downhill, because the first book, like building all these amazing concepts and like building them into something crazy. And then the next book doesn't really build as much. And the third book, again, it does a little bit of new stuff, but it's just not enough. And I think as well, it's missing some of the emotional journey of the first book. Anyway, I did enjoy some of the weirdness. I think if you really love the earlier books in the series, you'll still enjoy this one, but it's just, again, I guess similar to Age of Empire. It's like, it was close to being amazing, and so it feels just disappointing that it didn't make it. So that's School of Shards. Then we have The Dawnhounds by Sascha Stronach. This is a New Zealand author, and it's kind of like a biopunk story. We're following this young woman who is a cop, but her superiors have discovered that she's bisexual, and as a result, it's kind of like ruined her career, and she's trying to decide what she could do about that. My main criticism with this book is that she wasn't really trying to do anything about it. She was kind of just waiting for something to happen, and then this random guy showed up and said, come and do this slightly dodgy sounding thing with me, and she seemed to think that was going to help when it clearly wasn't. And then they did go to this place, and they maybe were going to learn things. To be honest, I DNF'd this at that point because I just found that I didn't care at all. And the writing was just so messy. There was so much world building kind of dumped into these chapters where I had no context of what was going on. It didn't seem relevant to what was going on. It didn't really even seem to all fit together very well. So I was just completely overwhelmed with the world building. I didn't get it. There were some interesting ideas in there, but it also didn't really give me any confidence that it was going to use a lot of those cool ideas. And I did actually skip forward later into the book, and it also didn't look like it was going to improve. And I will also say this is the traditional published version, and the ebook I read is as well, I'm pretty sure, because I've heard that the original self-published version was less good. So I'm glad I read this version, but still, unfortunately, just not for me. So if I'm putting these 3 books up against each other, we'll take away the Dawnhounds first since I DNF'd it. Doesn't really count. And then as well, we'll take away the Starving Saints because maybe I should have DNF'd that as well. I did definitely consider it quite a few times. So that means School of Shards is the winner of the battle, kind of by default, but I did like it. I just wish it had been a little bit more. Okay, then I have one last book to mention, although I'm not going to include it in the battle, I think, because it just doesn't really fit into the structure. Anyway, the book I'm talking about is Januaries by Olivie Blake, but as I have been saying, I didn't read this whole book. So this is a short story anthology, and basically the idea is there's a short story for every month of the year, and the sections are divided by seasons, starting with spring. So I started my reread of this book in spring with the idea that I'll read one short story every month. So this is the second month, and I read the second short story, which is called The Audit. And this one, there's basically this kind of thing where you can apply to have your retirement early. So you fill out this form and they do a little bit of analysis and they decide how much money you're going to have when you retire, and you get that money now. But then after enjoying that for a period of time, then you have to go to work and work until you die and basically pay back the money that they gave you in advance for your retirement. The idea being, of course, that it's annoying to have all that money for your retirement and all that time for your retirement when you're too old to enjoy it. So why not enjoy it while you're young? But the main character in this is actually like quite paralyzed by the idea of getting this money and the pressure to decide what he should do with it, as well as like finding out how much money he's actually going to get. And I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a mind-blowing short story in any way, but it was well written. It was definitely a very enjoyable read and had some interesting ideas in it. And I am enjoying my reread. This is another reread, actually. I am enjoying my reread of this short story anthology. I'm actually wondering how many of the books that I read this month were rereads. Oh, I've just realized it was 14 things, including this, that I read this month. And half of the things that I read were rereads. But that's okay. That's kind of what I was aiming for at the end of this year. Anyway, it is time for some semi-final battles to decide the best book of the month. So firstly, we're going to have God's War by Cameron Hurley up against Tower of Thorns by Juliet Marillier. And I do think we're going to pick God's War. I did enjoy Tower of Thorns, but it is kind of more of a fantasy romance. And while I was definitely emotionally invested, and there are some interesting ideas being explored, this explored a lot more interesting ideas and the characters had a lot more depth. I don't know, was I not emotional in the same way, but I definitely was emotionally connected to these characters. So that'll be one of the books in the final. And then we have The Fog by Caroline B. Cooney up against School of Shards by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko. And this is an interesting battle. This one I definitely feel a lot of nostalgia about. And it does have some lovely atmospheric writing. However, it is just a little YA thriller. There's not too much depth to it. The School of Shards has some really interesting ideas, like even though it wasn't everything I hoped it would be, I actually think maybe it was still more than The Fog. So I think I'm going to pick School of Shards. I didn't really expect School of Shards to make it as far as it has in this battle. The final battle for the best book of the month will be God's War by Cameron Hurley up against School of Shards by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko. And I guess it's obvious. I guess I'm going to pick God's War. I didn't expect this to win best book of the month because I didn't actually think I was going to let rereads win, but I think I've decided we're going to let that exception stand. I really love God's War. Definitely recommend it. Definitely excited to be continuing the trilogy this month. Definitely recommend it if you like kind of like dark and gritty sci-fi fantasy. And it definitely was the best book I read this month. So let me know if you've read this or any of the other books I talked about in this video. I would love to chat with you about them down in the comments, or let me know what was the best book you read in the month of October. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.